Today we are going to create the layout grid system that is similar to the one that uses Bootstrap. Bootstrap is a framework that developers often use, but keep in mind that developers can use another framework or they can choose not to use any framework at all. So it is your responsibility to build the grid and align all the elements to this grid, and then later communicate everything to the developer. Bootstrap uses a breakpoint system. Breakpoint is just the size of the screen. For example, we will have a breakpoint 1400, which means that everything that will be on this screen will be applied to the screen sizes more than 1400, including the layout grid. We will also have 1200 breakpoint that will be applied to all the screens that are more than 1200. Then we will have the grid that is more than 1000 and less than the next breakpoint. It is typically applied to the tablets in the landscape mode. We will also build the grid for the typical tablet in the portrait mode. It has a breakpoint of 768. It means that this grid will be applied to everything that is more than 768 until it meets the next breakpoint. And then we would build the mobile grid that would be applied to everything else that is less than 768. I've also put another breakpoint of 600 to make sure that everything looks good at this size, but we would use the same mobile grid for this breakpoint. Let's start with the biggest screen. For all the screens that are more than 1400, we would have a fixed grid, which means that grid would be fixed and would not be stretched. I have already put some blocks that should be aligned to the layout grid that I want to build. But currently we don't have any layout grid. You can see it in the design panel here. As you can see, there is no layout grid, and we are going to create one by clicking plus. Figma would create the rectangular grid system by default, which is not what we want. We want to create columns. To do this, we should change the grid to columns. We can also choose rows, but this is not what we currently want. We create columns. Then we should change the quantity of the columns to 12. We can also change the color of the layout grid. Then we can choose if the grid is stretched or if it has the fixed size with different alignments. For our biggest breakpoint, we are going to choose the fixed grid with centered alignment. Now, as you can see, the grid is aligned to the center. We need to change the width. I'll make 80 pixels. And we can also set the margin between the columns. I like to use bigger margins, so I'm going to set it by 32. Our first layout grid is ready. The grid is fixed, which means if the screen is bigger, the element would remain in the center. They would not be stretched together with the screen. And we do this because we don't know how big the screens can be. If it is enormous, for example, users usually watch TV with these screens, and you, for example, put a text for 6 columns, let's say, it can stretch so much so it would be impossible to read. By the way, do you see these marks like circles and lines that Figma shows us? It does so because it recognizes that all the elements are aligned to the grid. And it gives us the opportunity to adjust it easily. For example, I can change the order of the elements, or I can change the vertical or horizontal margins. I'm going to undo my changes and make everything as it was. Next breakpoint is 1200, and this breakpoint would have a stretch grid with the same 12 columns. I'm going to choose the screen and create the layout grid, change it by columns, set it to 12. But now I'm not going to change it to center. I'm going to leave it as stretched. As you can see, I cannot change the width of the columns because it is calculated automatically based on the screen size. But I can change the margin between the columns. I put the same 32 here. And I can also change the margin between the layout grid and the edge of the screen. I put the same 32. Let's compare the fixed grid and responsive grid. I'm going to copy my responsive grid and stretch it to the same size as my fixed grid. As you can see, my grid is adjusted automatically, and if I make it even larger, the grid would stretch. That's why we are putting fixed grid for the larger screen size. The next breakpoint is for tablet in the landscape mode. It is typically more than 1000, or in some breakpoint system it's more than 1024. The same, I am going to create columns grid, and now I will reduce the number of columns. Instead of 12, I will put 8. It would be stretched as well, and gutter and margin we would leave the same, 32 pixels. The next grid is for tablet in portrait mode, and here we would have even less columns. Instead of 12, we are going to have only 4. And because the screen is smaller, we will also reduce the gutter and the margin. Instead of 32, we will put 24. For mobile, I usually use only 2 columns, because the screen is so small that even 4 elements in a row is too much. So I'm going to put 2 columns, and I'm going to set gutter and margin to 16 pixels. As we've discussed, the 600 breakpoint would have the same layout grid as the mobile breakpoint. I can create the same layout grid manually, but I can also create a style for mobile layout grid so I can reuse it on other screens. To do this, I have to press 4 circles button. Here we have grid styles. We are going to create one. Now we can reuse it in another screen. I press the same button, and here I have my layout grid style. Let's do the same for other grids that we have already created. Now, if I reset the selection, I can see my grid styles in the design panel. 12 columns breakpoint system is probably the most popular one, but it's not the only breakpoint system that can be used. For example, many desktop applications often have the side navigation with fixed size. Let's try to create a grid for such layout. I'm going to create new grid. I'll also use 12 columns. But now I need to offset my 12 columns so they don't take the space for my side navigation. To do this, I have to align my columns to the left. Set size and gutter. And now I need to offset my layout grid from the left. What is the size of the offset? The size of my side navigation is 94 pixels. Plus, I have to add the size of the margin between the side navigation and the main content, which is 24 pixels in my case. Unfortunately, Figma doesn't have the possibility to create a stretched grid with the offset. So to communicate to developers that the content should be stretched, I usually put some notes for them. In this case, I clarify that the main content have 12 columns that take full width of the screen. Let's try to create the same layout but with bigger side navigation. 12 columns with 24 pixels gap, aligned to the left and with 74 pixels size. In this case, the size of my side navigation is 240 pixels, plus 24 pixels for margin. I hope you got the point. You probably wonder if it's really necessary to create all 6 breakpoints for every design project. I would say no. I usually use the fixed layout grid for the big screens. Then I create the layout for the tablet portrait mode, and I create the mobile layout. Usually it is enough to communicate to developers how the content should be adjusted to every screen size. And usually the clients are not ready to pay more for the extra flexibility. That's all for layout grids. You can find this file in the resources for this course. Try to build your own grid and experiment with them. In the next video we are going to learn how to use white space to create visual hierarchy.